in your life.
Good morning, everyone. It's V, the Gorilla, coming to you live again, and thankfully live. Couldn't have We had some serious issues with our morning show this morning because I don't know, Hangouts just wasn't being cooperative, but CJ was able to salvage it and get us up and running. But that being said, guys, it's that time again. It is that time. It's Monday, and when you know it's Monday, it's time for the Sirius Report with none other than the man, London Paul. It's always a treat to have London Paul on for him to break down the analysis of what's going on geopolitically, geostrategically, geoeconomically, worldwide. And if you haven't done so already, guys, I don't know what you're waiting for. You need to go to theseriesreport.com and subscribe to the premium podcast. Okay. We are huge fans of his work. It is having your own intelligence briefing every single day where you can have the finger to the pulse on what's going on, what's really important, and cutting through the BS, the distractions, because you want to talk about distractions? There's more distractions now, more than ever. Truly, the fog of war is incredibly thick, and you need the Sirius Report to shine the beacon. It is the lighthouse in this fog of disinfo. With that being said, Paul, how are you, sir?
Good morning to everyone, afternoon or evening, depending on what you're listening. Yeah, I'm fine, and yourselves?
Oh, we're hanging in there, man. I mean, was a little fired up this morning. I was just so frustrated with all the shenanigans, the never-ending nonsense of what's going on, and so many people, getting so many things wrong about what's going on. It's I'm at wit's end almost, Paul.
Well, no, I agree with you completely. It's becoming frustrating when you have to deal with the mainstream media, the mainstream analysts and commentators and the like. And then also in the alternative media, I'm fed up of reading people with all these ideas that these fanciful things are going to happen that's going to bail the world out and save everybody. And no, there's a harsh reality to what's coming, and
Yeah.
people are going to have to face it whether they like it or not. There's not going to be some amazing hand of fate that's going to flip everything on its head and save the world. No, that is not going to happen. And we've said this a long time. You've said it, I've said it, and still increasingly a large amount of people who don't subscribe to mainstream media but talk about the alternative media and hold it in high regard need to realize this is not a reality. And that's a big problem. But I thought I'd start today. It's kind of humorous in one sense, but absolutely perverse in another. It's something, I won't say who it is at this point, but it's a comment that somebody made in 1995 in the US regarding immigration. And I'll read it out. This is exactly what was said. It said, all Americans, not only in the states most heavily affected, but in every place in this country, are rightly disturbed by the large numbers of illegal aliens entering our country. The jobs they hold might otherwise be held by our citizens and legal immigrants. Public services they use impose burdens on our taxpayers. That is why our administration has moved aggressively to secure our borders more, to hire a record number of border guards, by deporting twice as many criminal aliens as before, by cracking down on illegal hiring, by barring welfare benefits to illegal aliens. And in the budget I will present to you, we will try to do more to speed up the deportation of illegal aliens arrested for crimes. To better identify illegal aliens in the workplace, we are a nation of immigrants, but we are also a nation of laws. It is wrong and ultimately self-defeating for a nation of immigrants to permit the kind of abuse of our immigration laws that we have seen in recent years, and we must do more to stop it. Now, the interesting thing is, that was Bill Clinton when he was the US president in 1995.
Wow.
And
Sounds like
so for
Trump.
all you, yeah, well, yeah, probably more extreme than Trump. And that's
Yeah.
for all the people who vote for Democrats and think, oh, they have such a radical view and a different opinion on things. It's incredulous that the criticism Trump has had, when that's precisely more or less what he said. Okay, so maybe slightly different use of language and verbiage in terms of what he's explained. But that's what Clinton said, what, 22 years ago?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And it's
for
it's it's
anyone who
amazing.
thinks that this is some revolutionary way of dealing with a problem in the US, well, there's your answer.
Yeah, absolutely correct. There's nothing that Trump is doing right now that's so remarkable or hasn't been done before in U.S. history or in world history to begin with, man. It's just that people have a selective memory and people have a very selective. People they don't read. Nobody thinks anymore, Paul. Everybody's an axiom repeater. Everybody just repeats axioms. because it's become so cliche just to repeat it. It's so convenient to repeat an axiom.
Absolutely. And in terms of immigration issues, there was an incident very recently where there was a security breach at JFK,
Mm.
where they allowed people to board flights without being checked by Transportation Safety Administration personnel. And this was confirmed. And apparently, 3 passengers breached security, but they didn't receive a mandatory second screening after metal detector alarms went off.
Oh my God.
I mean, what the hell's going on? I mean, and then people moan and complain. The thing with Trump, people, whether they like it or not, and didn't like what his immigration issue was in terms of having a temporary ban, the point in the US, and it's not just the US, it's probably in the UK and every Western nation, the process through which immigration happens or people go through, if I go on holiday to the US, it is fundamentally flawed. There's major problems, and that just highlights it. How could something as ridiculous as that, I mean, I have this habit when I walk through detectors of always setting them off. I don't know why. They search you and go, no, there's nothing, don't worry about it, carry on. Now, if I was stood behind someone, saw someone walk through a detector, it went off, and then they just went, oh, carry on, don't worry about it. First thing I'd be thinking is, what the hell are they playing at? I mean,
Yeah.
the people who did this, how did they allow this to happen?
Right.
Now, apparently, from what I understand, the US Homeland Security is going to create a panel to examine weaknesses in government system that could allow terrorists to infiltrate the US. Now, I'm not suggesting these passengers are terrorists, but the point is there needs to be a recognition there is a fundamental problem. Now, what Trump's proposed was seemed extreme, but what do you do? Now, people say, well, you just bar every nation coming into the country. Well, all he did was say, we're going to exclude nations that was on Obama's list anyway. There is a problem. And what he's trying to highlight is there is a serious problem in terms of how the immigration process, and immigration can mean I'm just coming to the US for just, I'm coming to visit you guys for a month in the US and I'm going to tour around and see a few people we know. You have to go through a proper process. If there's flaws in it, you risk allowing people coming into the country who may pose a problem. No, it's not saying everybody's a problem, but we are highlighting issues. And how often do these security breaches happen? Be it
All the
in
time.
JFK, be it in Heathrow, be it anywhere in the world. These are massive problems that need to be addressed. And thus far, people, all they do is go, this is not acceptable. We can't have this kind of process going on. Well, they'll be the first people to complain if something happens in their country as a
Yeah.
result of negligent processes in handling simple matters in terms of just immigration into a country. How, people, it doesn't matter whether they're going to live there or they're going on holiday. But it's absolutely farcical that this kind of thing goes on and nothing's done about it.
I
And
agree
that's why
wholeheartedly.
something has to be dealt with.
Oh, I agree wholeheartedly, man. It's like when you look at the statistics, I mean, there were so many tests done by DHS against the TSA where they've had people walk on with, with dummy bombs and dummy weapons, and they were able to go right through screening without any issues. Like 97% failure rate. These guys in the TSA are freaking useless, okay? But Paul, on the bright side, not a single bottle of shampoo above 3 ounces has made it through, Paul. Not a
Yeah.
single shampoo above 3 ounces has made it through. That's
or a
on
bottle
the
of
bright side.
or a bottle of water that's half a litre.
Yeah, yeah. None of
I mean,
those
that's
get
the point,
through.
that's the point. You could, if I take a bottle of 250 mils, not a problem. But somehow, if it's 500 mils, it could be a bomb. It
Oh
could be
yeah, it
something.
could be. It
But,
could be a
do you
liquid
think
bomb.
by now that the people, if they were going to do this, would have worked this out and gone, well, hang on, we'll just distill it down a bit. It might not make as much a bigger explosion, but 250 mils of water should be sufficient. I mean, this kind of insanity,
Hmm.
it just keeps going on and on. And then there's people moaning and complaining about the fact, I don't have an issue. Yeah, I do go through the amount of times. I mean, at least when I travel backwards and forwards here, there, and everywhere on planes quite a bit. And yeah, I have this problem. I seem to walk through it, and for no reason it goes off. Do I care that the fact they come and search me? No, fine, do it. I don't have a problem. You take hand luggage through, and sometimes because we take laptops through or whatever, they'll pull it apart, have a look at things. I go, fine, be my guest. I don't have an issue with that. I don't care about that. But the problem is if you have a system that fails, and like we say, you're allowed to take this through, but yeah, bottles of shampoo, none. Yeah, that's a big problem. But you say, dummy weapons and everything. It's insane. But I highlighted the point. The point about Clinton is when people should look back in history, because you'll see countless examples of the very things that everyone's up in arms about now were going on 20 years ago. And none of these people were complaining then. They should ask the question, who are all these people making a big fuss about what Trump's saying? I mean, we know, and we've talked about this before, there's clearly issues where there is people trying to undermine, and I'll talk about something in a little bit to do with Obama in that regard. It's clearly going on, but people don't forget, as you say, they don't read in history, they're not interested. It's like they're only interested in what's happening today. I was just saying to someone before, I get exasperated by people. You know, a celebrity gets 10 million likes because they said, I got drunk last night. Meanwhile,
Yes.
meanwhile, in the real world, there's huge problems going on, and everyone's, well, I'm not interested in that. That's boring. I don't care about that. I
Yeah.
mean, and this is the big problem, and you know, it does get really frustrating. And you could hear earlier, I listened to the last 20 minutes of your talk, and you got very frustrated. But the frustration is because there are these huge problems, and you know, something we can kind of move on to do with the U.S. economy and this debt ceiling deadline on the 15th. Now, we know for the fiscal year for 2016, the
Yeah.
US had total revenues roughly $3 trillion, total spending roughly 3.55. So more or less, there's a deficit of 550 billion, let's say.
Hmm.
Now, the thing is, the issue is we've got this approaching debt ceiling deadline on the 15th. Now, we've had these precedents where it always goes to the wire, and what are they going to raise the debt ceiling, or they're not going to bother? Are we going to have this, you know, government holiday, and the whole nation's going to collapse? And of course, it's all grand theatre. Except this time around, from what I understand, by all accounts, they are seriously considering going, no, we're not raising the debt ceiling anymore. That's it. Because here's the problem Trump has: if they just allow to kick this insane can down the road, the risk you have is what's it going to last? Another 6 months? Another year? In a year's time, everyone's going to blame Trump for the economic collapse. Undoubtedly, if an economic collapse happens sooner, people are going to can't really say, well, the Trump administration's responsible, because it would be. I mean, nobody could say that. How can he be responsible when he's been in office a month already? It's just incredulous. So, from what I understand, there are serious considerations that they are just going to say, well, we're not going to carry on with this madness. We're not going to bother just like, oh, let's just raise the debt ceiling to 25 trillion or whatever we want, whatever it needs to be. So the question then comes in, well, okay, if they don't raise the debt ceiling, what happens? Because the US government as well is responsible for 1/5, I think, or 1 to 1/3 of US GDP.
Yeah.
So any risk in the government spending, if you put a cap on, it's going to stall the economy.
Right.
Now, and any risk to paying government debts is going to cause a bond crisis in the world, because everyone goes, oh, the US, it's all safe haven, and it's all about the dollar's credibility. Well, you and I and many other people know that's nonsense, but that's the illusion that is perpetrated out there, and people believe it to be true. Now, obviously, Trump has already said publicly, yeah, it's an absolute mess, the economy, everything's out of control. Well, of course it is. And they're going to have to do things over the coming years. Now, the question then will, of course, be, well, okay. And everyone's focusing on the fact of well, how does Trump balance his budget? Because he wants to have this massive infrastructure program spent. He wants military expenditure. He wants tax cuts. But of course, what nobody or very few people are talking about is we're going to have the end of the Federal Reserve note, or the US dollar as the reserve currency. The US is going to have its own currency. Call it a treasury dollar, call it what you like, it doesn't matter. It is going to have to be devalued,
Yeah.
because you mentioned earlier before, there is no gold in Fort Knox. It's an illusion. Well, I heard there was a couple of barrels with a few gold bars in it. That's the reality. There is no gold there. The US doesn't have 8,000 tons of gold. Doesn't matter who out there tells you, it's not reality. And of course, we're going to have the adoption of a gold standard. And everyone goes, well, that's not going to happen. Well, what do they think Russia and China have been doing? Why are they buying all the gold? Why have they set up the AIIB SIPs?
Yep.
Why are they doing all these things? They're not doing it for the fun of it, because it just seems like, oh, it was a great idea. Or as I think it was Jim Rickard said, well, they just did it until they got an invite into the SDR. Now they've got an
Oh, get the
invite
heck
into the
out of here!
SDR.
Right.
Yeah,
That's totally wrong. China doesn't care about the
exactly.
IMF. If I was China and if I wanted my currency to have more access to various swap facilities throughout the world, the IMF would be the perfect Trojan horse that I would use in order to achieve that. China doesn't care. They would have set up the AIIB if they cared about the IMF. They would have set up the New Silk Road if they cared about the IMF. I
Exactly.
love it how people they forecast into an echo chamber. They have no idea what's going on globally, Paul.
Well, no, and they don't. They never report on the reality of what's going on. They never put any context, as you say, and say, well, hang on, why is Russia and China doing what they're doing? Why are they buying all this gold? Although there was an interesting article in the FT, of all places, that essentially said, Russia's economy is now on the bounce. It's quite strong and stable. You should
Yeah.
do what all Russians are doing, buy gold. I mean,
Right.
there's a trickle of this coming out now where there's a realization that, it is time to start assessing things differently. And on the
Yeah.
back of this, are they going to raise the debt ceiling or not? You've got the Feds going, well, we're actually contemplating raising interest rates because the recent macroeconomic data gives us all these reasons to be optimistic. Well, every macroeconomic piece of data I see, and there's one that came out today that, literally only an hour or two ago. If you look at just core durable goods in the US and peg that against the Dow, now it's pretty much since 2005, it's followed the peaks and troughs, when we had the global crisis in 2008/2009, and then kind of early 2012, the durable goods has basically flatlined and has sort of dropped a bit since then. Meanwhile, the Dow's gone up 50% in that time. Now, whereas people out there going, hang on, there's no correlation. You're telling us on the one hand that when we know why the Dow's going through the roof, but when you look at all the economic factors stacked up against, it's like the S&P, the earnings, the S&P goes to the record highs and the earnings are falling off a cliff edge. And the list goes on and on and on and on and on. And none of these people are asking the obvious question. So there's the first point. Where's this economic strength? The second thing is they're saying, well, we might raise interest rates. Well, if they raise interest rates in March, well, that's going to create a massive headache. But none of that. They've now saying, well, we're going to have this substantial effort to unload our bloated balance sheet. Well, who's going to buy all the crap that's on their balance sheet? That's the question.
Yeah. How's the Fed going to unload almost $5 trillion on their balance? How are they going to unload that? And it's funny,
Yeah,
and that's the question that was posed, and I think it was one of the idiots over at Wall Street Journal. Now, there's a dish rag that gets it right. So the Wall Street Journal, the guy, one of the writers, and I forgot who it was, Paul, he was saying, well, the Fed could probably go on a buying spree. Maybe they could buy some banks. And I'm like, I'm literally like he was creating a shopping list of 10 or 15 items that the Fed could go out and spend their balance sheet on, thinking that having a $4.5 trillion balance sheet is a good and positive thing. I mean, you have to be a nut job Keynesian to think that.
Oh yeah, it's absolute rubbish. And of course, the other thing they don't say is, well, if we keep raising interest rate, what's going to happen to the interest rate swap in the derivatives? I think the four major US banks hold about 90% of interest rate swaps. Then what's it going to do to the bond market? You're going to have this bond market carnage. And then the question is the rest of the world going to sit there and go, oh, this is going to, no, they're just going to dump dollars like there's no tomorrow. So yeah, great policy there by the Feds in terms of raising interest rate, but it's just to feed the bullshit that everything's fine in the US economy. I mean, I have people saying, yeah, but the Dow's at 21,000, whatever, maybe it's at 200,000 next week. Who knows what it's going to be? I mean, it's this kind of level of basic ignorance of the fact that it's irrelevant. The market's approved if you peg any major kind of macroeconomic data and extrapolate it against the stock market, you just see where probably 2012, around that point, the divergence between economic reality and the Dow or the S&P or the DAX or the FTSE or whatever else, it just doesn't work. And the other question is, in simple terms, why do all these indices all marry each other? Why is it when one goes up on one day, they all go up, and then
Which
on another
should
day when they
never
all go
happen.
down? Yeah,
Which should never happen in an unmanipulated market. And that's the biggest sign there. You nailed it, Paul.
Yeah, exactly. It's absolute rubbish. And so going back to the point, and then of course, this is the issue is, in terms of what Trump's got to do, look, here's the bottom line. Trump knows exactly what's coming. He knows that the US economy when he says it's a mess, he knows it's far worse than that. He knows that the US is going to have a devalued dollar. He knows exactly what's coming. Now, the question is he going to sit there come March the 15th and go, well, we'll just kick the can down the road. So in 6 months, the world's going to blame me for another economic crisis, because everyone will forget what's exactly happened since 28 when we had the last one, and the reality of what's unfolded there. No one will remember that because they don't even remember what happened last week. Never mind 8 years ago.
Yeah.
Does he take that risk or doesn't he now? From what I understand, of course, if they don't raise that, then the serious question is how are they going to finance anything? I mean, you've got a budget deficit of, well, probably 50 billion roughly a month. Now, it's probably going to increase. Now, if you don't have the money coming in terms of being able to, you're going to have to shut down certain aspects of the government. Well, that's the start of the problem. But normally we've had these budget crises, and after 2 or 3 weeks or whatever, they sort the problem out and everyone goes, kicks the can down the road and the world carries on. But if this time he doesn't, then what happens? Well, ultimately, who becomes responsible? Well, the government itself is going to then have to, i.e. Trump administration is going to have to take control of the finance and say, well, this is what we're going to do, this is what we're going to finance, and this is what we're not going to finance. This is going to create mayhem. But the problem is, do you take the bad medicine now or push it down the road in 6 months, a year, like I said, and then take the bad medicine? Now, if I was the Trump administration, I'd be thinking, well, I don't want to be held responsible, because that's exactly what all his people who dislike him, what the
Yeah.
Democrats are going to do, the governments all over the Western world, they'll go, Trump caused this economic collapse in 2017 or whenever it might be. He's responsible. It's his insane economic policies that caused this. Well, if I was him, I'd be making strides to make sure nobody believed that. And he doesn't have a huge window in which to convince people that
Right.
that's not the case. Because at the moment, the Wall Street hacks or anyone else can say what the hell they like. They cannot pull off the idea that Trump's going to be held responsible for that.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely correct. And I think timing is of the essence, man. I mean, it's better to have it over and done with now. I've said this, so many other guys have said this as well. It's better to just get it over with now rather than pushing it out, making it worse. Because my thing is this: if we don't collapse it, it's like the bad guys, the cabal, because of the fictitious phantom wealth, they still control the money. They still have all the wealth because of this phantom, fake economy that's been running for the last several years and last several decades. So to end it now would be a great deal. I'd rather get it over with at this point, Paul.
Yeah, from my perspective, I completely agree with you. It's pointless. Every day it carries on, it's causing more and more damage. I mean, back in 2008, the too big to fail should have just been closed down. That would have been a 9-day wonder, and the world would have got back on its feet. And by now, we wouldn't have had the mess we had. Everyone knows the reality is all they've done in terms of QE and zero interest rate policy is to prop up the Wall Street, prop up all the banks, and stop their own gravy train collapsing. And that, again, another myth. And I've heard it, even now I'm getting people saying, oh, it's just a big game. The cabal are just crashing the financial system. Well, why didn't they do it in 2008? They've had 8 years when they've done everything to stop it crashing, to maintain their supremacy for that. And it's not even 1%, it's fractions of 1% of people to enrich that. If that weren't true, then they could have just done it. And they
Yeah.
haven't, because they're not interested in crashing it, because when it goes, so does their whole way of life, every aspect, everything they've strived to achieve, as you say, for decades and beyond. And from a US perspective, that goes back to the inception of the Federal Reserve. That's when everything started going wrong. And
Right.
of course, where do we hear historians talking about that? Or when do I hear some great talking head on Bloomberg or anywhere else saying, well, hang on, let's look at the correlation of where it all went wrong from 1913. Oh no, let's not bother doing that because that's just a bit uncomfortable, and we don't really want people to see that. So yeah, it has to happen. It's going to happen. It's not going to be pretty. No one ever said it was. But the longer it goes on, the worse it's going to be. But
Right.
for the people out there who you know are really interested that some celebrity got drunk, well, I'm wondering what they're going to make of reality when it hits them, because they're going to suffer hugely because they're not interested. And it does get frustrating, and you can see the frustration you were suffering earlier. I get frustrated. I know I'm pretty calm most of the time, but I'm reaching a point, I'm getting so fed up because I have to wade through so much dross,
Yeah.
and people saying no, but it must be this because, and then they go, well, you said these things are going to happen, but they haven't quite happened yet. Well, yeah, and a lot of things have happened, but we don't have a crystal ball. We know what's going to happen. We can't give precise dates. And then when you don't give a precise date, they get upset and go, well, why aren't you telling us when it's going to happen? We don't know precisely, but the reality is that day is getting closer and closer when reality is going to hit home. And people are going to have to face a lot of uncomfortable truths. But if we're going to get through this, we're going to have to do this. The alternative is we'd have ended up with Clinton and probably would have incinerated the world. So
Hmm.
there's no alternative. It's Trump has got a window where he's going to have to do a heck of a lot in a short space of time. And yes, he's going to make unpopular decisions. And I've talked to a few people about this lately. Yes, I don't agree with quite a lot of his foreign policy. I think the idea of, we talked about this, Iran, what they're doing, although they've kind of softened and gone a bit quiet about that,
Yeah.
is ridiculous. But they're getting sucked into a game in the Middle East. And the problem is, it's a game of, you've got Turkey, you've got Syria, you've got China, you've got Russia, you've got Iraq, and now you're getting Afghanistan. And all these nations are forming an alliance of, we've got a problem in the Middle East and we need to deal with it. And on the flip side, you've got a bunch of Middle Eastern nations who Israel wants to draw into an alliance because they've got issues with Iran. And they're all getting sucked into this game where it's become these nations against Iran. And the US needs to walk away from this and say, we are having nothing to do with this. I mean, Saudi is in a massive hole. They're effectively bankrupt. There was documents leaked the other day that the Saudi regime had wanted to borrow $10 billion in aid from Kuwait
Huh.
because they have no money. I mean, do they really think the situation could be anything other than extreme for them to go and do that? Apparently, there's fierce internal conflicts amongst the Saudis now in
Yeah.
terms of what's going on globally, in terms of the policy, and also in terms of the kingdom itself, and also what they're doing in Yemen. There's massive problems in these nations. Now, the US needs to say, we're not getting involved in this rubbish. People talk about saving money. Well, if the US stopped fighting all these, I mean, how much it's cost them tens of trillions of dollars for decades.
Right.
In pointless wars they never need to get involved with. Trump's absolutely correct. If they just stop doing that, and then people have got these concerns about the US military and saying, well, he wants to beef up the military. Well, here's the point. The nuclear weapon's absolutely pointless. Yeah, I agree. There's more weapons in this world that could incinerate the planet 20 times over or whatever. But in terms of the US military, there is going to be this problem of terrorism that's not going to go away tomorrow, next week, next month, next year. And the
Right.
US Army needs to be better equipped because its equipment is absolutely rubbish.
Rubbish. Rubbish.
It's, and that's being polite. We could use a
Yeah.
lot stronger words, and maybe one day we'll just let vent spleen and let go with us. But they have to have up-to-date equipment. If they're going to fight the real wars going forward, and the real war is going to be terrorism, there's got to be a global perspective on this and how it's dealt with, and that means all nations on the world, including the US and Russia and China, are all going to get together at some point and drop all this facade and go, we've got a major problem. We don't care anymore who created. I don't care who was responsible for creating Al Qaeda back in the 70s in terms of Afghanistan and all that kind of stuff. Yes, it's historical, but the reality is we've got a major problem. Whoever caused it doesn't matter. Let's just deal with it, get it sorted. The US military is going to need decent equipment and hardware to deal with these problems.
Yeah.
That's a reality. And people are getting all up in arms about it. That's why the US military needs to be upgraded. Yeah, there is a separate issue and the whole START thing with Russia about, oh, you're doing this, we're not happy with this START agreement. It's rather, that's obviously the strategic nuclear agreement. It doesn't matter because ironically, Russia's got less missiles than they were allowed to have. And they just said, well, okay, we'll just produce some more missiles and we'll make parity on that. But they were doing it in a farcical, tongue-in-cheek way. It's irrelevant. The nuclear weapon situation, forget it. It's just pointless. And it's not a reality. It's not going to make a scrap of difference because, from my perspective, there isn't going to be another nuclear war. If there is, what the hell? So why do we bother spending all these years trying to resolve problems if we're just going to go down that route? There's got to be enough cool heads in the world that says this is madness. It's not going to happen. There's no way Trump wants a nuclear war. There's no way Putin does or wants it. Nobody wants it. It's madness. So, but the US military, yes, it does need to be upgraded. It needs a huge amount spent to make it so. Whether people like it or not, there's people in the US military, they don't choose to go to Afghanistan. They don't choose to go to these places or Iraq or anything else. But they were put in horrendous situations. I mean, I know someone in the UK, there's a friend of mine whose son was out there. He was actually a medic and he was out there. And he said the things that went on were horrendous, that people are ill-equipped and they are literally, and to use a very crude phrase, it's cannon fodder. I
Yeah.
mean, this is US troops, UK troops. It has to end. This cannot carry on. If they're going to address a real problem, then they need to be equipped. And whether people like that or not, that's a stark reality. So I'd support him on that. But yes, some of the policy, I mean, there's rumblings to do with Russia and China, but what you can say is behind the scenes, there's a lot of diplomacy going on, a lot of smoothing things over. And Trump's in a position where he's got to appear to be tough on the Russians because the media and everyone else is hounding him, accusing him of, and there's no evidence. The FBI have said there's no evidence of collusion between Russia and Trump. There's no evidence that Russia did actually infiltrate the US election. Everyone knows it because if the evidence existed, they'd have busted Trump already.
Yeah.
Everybody knows that. So there'll be this game going on. They're accusing him of things, but from a public perception, he has to win the people over. And we've spoken about this previously, and it's absolutely the case. But yeah, it's a very difficult job. I mean, he knew full well what he was letting himself in for, but now he's elected. He's the best option the US has got, whatever people may think. The alternative would have been unspeakable, and that's the reality of what he's trying to deal with.
And speaking of the alternative, the daughter of Beelzebub herself, she was on the TV, Paul, stating that she gave a video announcement, and she was stating that I am with you to resist, to fight, and I will with you. I'll be with you every step of the way. Unbelievable. The level of opposition by the cabal has been turned to level 11. I mean, they are pulling close to $1 billion at this point, man, trying to go after Trump. It's again, it's truly remarkable to see this happening.
Yeah, and even even on maybe even a bigger level is Obama. I mean,
Yeah.
I talked about something in the podcast, but there's something else that I've unearthed, and I thought, well, I'll mention about this. Apparently, there's lawyers who are working with Obama have formed this non-profit organization called United to Protect Democracy, which aims at filing lawsuits against Trump's administration.
Yep.
And apparently, the group plans to investigate Trump, give him information to the press to build pressure for congressional investigations and eventually lawsuit. Now, this is the kind of level. Apparently, they've already filed 50 Freedom of Information Act requests and seeks to create a place for whistleblowers in the Trump administration. Now, this is, Obama's tied up in this. Obama lives what 2 miles from the White House.
Yep. The
Nobody seems
shadow
to have
White
an
House.
issue. Yeah, yeah, exactly. No one seems to have a problem with this or think, hang on, what's going on? And then, incredulously, on the flip side, I still get people going, but Trump's cabal is just playing a game. I mean, seriously, when did you last see a cabal president come under the kind of pressure he's coming under? I mean, it's just not
Never.
reality.
Right.
No, exactly, never.
The only other time I've seen something like this was when Putin got elected.
Yeah, yes, exactly. And of course, over a great many years, that's gradually
Yeah.
dissipated. But yeah, of course, when Putin was first elected, the oligarchs, because I mean, they'd infiltrated the Russia in every capacity, and it's taken them basically it took them a decade to rid the Western cabal through their oligarchs out of Russia, and that's why a lot of them have left or ended up in prison or anything else. But absolutely, and then of course the biggest problem in the US, and it's something I did a really big detailed analysis on one of the podcasts for the subscribers, was about the CIA. Now, in very broad terms, there's three groups in the CIA. There's the original CIA, and then of course there's the Bush CIA, and there's the ex-CIA CIA.
Mm.
I mean, and they're all at war with each other, but they're all fundamentally at war with Trump. Now, but Trump does have some support in the CIA, but this is why he's chained them to the desk. And interesting, we've had of late where the White House instructed the CIA to stop military support of armed groups associated with the Free Syrian Army. The friendly rebels who are doing nice things on behalf of the Syrian people in Syria.
Oh,
Now,
yes, the real freedom fighters over there, Paul.
yeah, absolutely. They're lovely, cuddly, warm people. And for several, yeah, but we know for several years that the CIA has been training them, providing assistance, arming them. I mean, they've armed them with light and heavy ammunition, but they're instructed a month ago to freeze all assistance. Now, no official reason was given for the sudden termination. Well, I think we can have a guess what that is, because Trump said he wants an end to America's overt and covert support for the likes of the FSA, and of course, indirectly, the US has provided arms, and where have the arms ended up? well, they didn't end up with the FSA. They ended up in the hands of Daesh or whoever else. So that's an interesting development. But ultimately, the CIA controls all the umbrella of the US American intelligence agencies. So when the CIA says something, the rest of them just go, yes, sir, no, sir.
Right.
And also, who controls this? The CIA ultimately controls everything. Whether
Yeah.
people think, well, that's not possible. It's like everyone blames the Federal Reserve for the US economic malaise. Well, no, it's the Exchange Stabilization Fund. They tell the Federal Reserve what to do, and they go, yeah, okay. Who ultimately controls the Exchange Stabilization Fund? The CIA.
Yeah.
And this is the problem. So it's very convenient that everyone just. I mean, the cabal are quite happy for everybody to point fingers at the Federal Reserve and for them to take all the flack, and that's why, of course, the Federal Reserve buys all these wonderful assets up that are worth so much money that you and I are begging to buy them off them when they reduce their balance sheet. I mean, it's that kind of level of stupidity that so it's great. Let the Federal Reserve carry all the flack. Meanwhile, the reality is the real economic problems stem in a far-flung different organisation, and we've talked about them before. The Exchange Stabilization Fund that people don't know about, don't talk about, and it's hugely important that people realise that just how insidious the CIA are, and everyone thinks, oh, it's always in terms of overseas policy and what's going on in Syria. No, it encompasses everything that goes on inside the US as well.
Oh man, yeah, absolutely. I mean, anybody who thinks that Janet Yellen is somebody who is able to is the brains in the Fed, you're really out of touch with reality.
Well, well, yeah, absolutely, and no, I mean, it's like rather like Draghi in the ECB. I mean, he says something, and you sit there and go, what were you actually saying?
Yeah.
Because it makes zero sense. It's just platitude upon platitude, and
I mean,
I mean,
the Eurozone's in a whole heap of trouble. Look what happened this morning. We talked about the Target 2 balances are way off.
well,
Capital
let's
flight.
talk about that because
Yeah.
there's some interesting stuff out the Europe the EU now. Apparently, there was some report leaked from the ECB. I don't know who by, probably not Draghi, but somebody. And the European debt's about 20 trillion euros at the moment. Now, it's believed that any potential exit of Greece and the inability to repay its debt, obviously, there's you know as well as I do, it's Greek debt just doesn't mean Greek debt because there's it's like France is on the hook. Sorry, Germany's on the hook for 90% of France's debt, blah, 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 and it
Yeah.
filters through the system. Now, apparently, the the losses from a potential Greek exit are slated at being $1.5 trillion.
Yep. Hmm.
And then you look at the Greek situation, and up till I think in the next 13 years, Greece will only have to pay 320 billion euros, of which 160 billion is interest that they shouldn't pay because no one should pay interest because that's the whole farcical cabal system. Borrow money that doesn't exist but pay interest on it. And when Greece manages to repay that debt, which according to the IMF is a certainty, then there's another 300 billion more they'll have to pay after that. I mean, it's just insane. And this is precisely why the Troika, which is the ECB, the IMF, and the European Commission, wants to keep Greece locked inside the euro currency, apart from the fact that ultimately they want to asset strip the entire nation and take everything off everybody.
Yeah.
And the utter stupidity is that Tsipras has said that oh, he's just kowtowing to them when he doesn't realise Greece is in a very strong negotiating position because they can say, look, if you don't help us, we're just going to leave the European Union and we're just going to blow everything up. What are you going to do? Because the criteria for the further Greek bailouts is that they've got to show something like 2.5% growth in GDP in 2017. I mean, seriously? I mean, growth? They haven't had any growth for years, and then suddenly they're going to magically have that level of growth, and then apparently it's going to be even greater in 2018. And when they don't do that, they're going to apply even more punishing austerity on the people. I mean,
Well, it's
they've
easy,
had
Paul. They can show that kind of growth. All they got to do is start reporting more nefarious activities, like more human smuggling, and maybe some, how much pedophile videos are coming out every week. I mean, those are the types of industries that will really, be the magic multiplier used for the GDP reporting, Paul. That can really help out them. help them out.
Well, yes, exactly.
Madness.
But Greece just should say we're not putting up with these absurd demands. We're going to leave. But arguably, of course, the reason when Greece was sacrificed and has been amongst, no, not the only nation, is to save the EU and particularly the French and German banks. And
Yep.
we can go through some of the nations in the EU very quickly.
Yeah.
In terms of EU nations, Austria, there's open kind of hostility now to the European Union. That's within the people, within the ranks of the government. You've got where Hungary and Poland are deciding to form some kind of union and are striking back against the EU. And interestingly, by all accounts, for some inexplicable reason, Poland have been accused of violating some of their constitution because they want to change laws. And there's rumours that the European Union may impose sanctions on Poland. I mean, what the? It's just. I mean, it's absurd. And then of course you've got France. Yeah, you've got France where everyone seriously now believes Le Pen might well get elected. and of course there's absolute panic.
What's Germany.
Yeah. Germany's in this open revolt. Everyone's had and we talked about the kind of dynamics with Germany and Russia. They're becoming more and more overt in terms of Germany moving towards Russia. We talked about Greece being a problem. We know Italy's massive problem in terms of their bank. You've got the Dutch elections coming up where, the so-called far right guy, who is pretty extreme by anybody's standard, is likely to get the most seats. Now, will he actually win a majority? Probably not. And is anyone going to want to form a coalition government with him? Unlikely. But who knows? On the day of the vote, anything could happen. So, and you just list through the nation. You look at the UK, and we don't. I mean, even though I'm in the UK, I don't talk about it. You're seeing some of the high-end kind of supermarkets are making people redundant. They're closing branches. This is not the sign of a strong economy. And they came out with this great quote the other day where they went, well, I think people's debt in December was £220 billion, and now people's credit card debt is now 500 billion. This is great. This is economy. Great for the economy.
Yeah,
no, hang on, that's debt. And so you're basing the whole predication on the strength of your economy is because people borrowed all this money to pay stuff. Well, when are they going to pay this back? Oh, and you're talking about raising interest rates. Well, what's that going to do to people's financial predicament if they're not already in one? I mean, the question is, why are they borrowing all this money to pay things? Because they don't have any. And that's not a strength of an economy, but that's the kind of illusion that's coming out. So if you look across the whole swathe of the European Union, nation after nation's had enough. We know the Czech Republic's had enough. There's rumblings in Belgium where they're fed up with the CETA agreement. The CETA agreement will never see the light of day. That's the one with Canada, because every nation is up in arms and says it's just not acceptable. I mean, the Canadians think it's great, but no one in Europe does in reality. And the European Union, I mean, Finland's a great one because the Russophobic nature of their government has got to the point that the Finnish people are saying, do you know what, we just don't buy this crap anymore. There's so much histrionics about Russia, we just don't believe it. And it's the same in, Norway's not part of the EU, but obviously it's in Europe. And there's Norwegians saying, look, we want to do business with Russia. We're fed up of all this bullshit about the fact that Russia's going to come and invade us at a moment's notice. We just don't buy this crap. And this is the age-old thing. It's what happened with Brexit. It's what happened in terms of Trump in the US. It might be why Le Pen ends up getting elected, although they're doing everything they can to try and stop her even standing by all these cases where apparently people have been involved in some nefarious activities, allegedly. But the reality is, all this kind of pressure that's coming from the media is just arousing more and more people to say, we're fed up of this. We're sick and tired of you treating us like we're imbeciles. We can see through this rubbish and insane crap that you're coming out with. And that's why now the populist parties, so to speak, are getting elected, because people are going, well, do you know what? It's better to have someone else. Now, the problem is, I'm not advocating that these are always the solutions, because you might end up getting, in certain nations, people being elected and they may just be wholly unsuitable. That's how desperate people have got, because the greatest thing the cabal's doing is waking people up in the process by the insane rumblings. And about Russia or whatever else is going on in the world and blaming everybody for all the problems they've created and inferring, that somehow we're just the victims in all this process.
Yeah, absolutely correct, man. Absolutely correct. And people are waking up to it because none of this makes sense. Because, God forbid you have one nuclear power gets along well with another nuclear power. God forbid that happens, Paul. My God, No, it's better that we with a overstretched military, with crap hardware, with a plane that can't fly, tanks that can't shoot, we're going to go to war with the Russians. Yeah, that makes so much more sense. It's a much better world for our kids to inherit. Yes. It's unreal.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, and also there was people moaning and complaining when Trump said, we need to, that, I know, yes, there are incidents. We have it all over the world in terms of the police, and we know there's police brutality and the police have done unspeakable things. But the truth is, I mean, they rig all the statistics in terms of the amount of crime that goes on. But in the last, I think, 2.5 years in the US, 27 of the country's 35 largest cities have seen rises in homicide rates.
Yep.
Now, and he mentioned Chicago's an obvious one of them. Baltimore has gone through the roof. I was looking at some data. There's Memphis, Milwaukee. Ironically, New York's kind of dropped for the last sort of 15, 20 years. And Washington was one time the murder capital of the world in the 90s. Well, it isn't anymore. That's kind of dropped off. But there is a serious problem. Now, what is Trump supposed to do? Just ignore this and say we're not going to deal with it? And by all accounts, in Chicago, there's been a lot of support from very unlikely sites who says, we've got to end this madness. And it is a huge, huge problem. And there is certainly no doubt in the UK as well. I mean, okay, we don't have the same sort of those kind of problems, but we do have where there's a lot of crime that clearly occurs and it's not reported. And people are given this idea that, oh, well, it's not, we don't really have problems. And we have a police force that's incapable, even if it wants to, of dealing with problems. And often, unless there's literally someone bursting down the door and threatening to kill someone, they won't come out. If you phoned up and said, there's someone in my garden shed stealing everything and loading into a van, they'll just say, well, we haven't got any resources to come out and deal with that problem. Well, this is kind of insanity, but there is a big problem. And the previous administration in the US, and it's also guilty in the UK and elsewhere, has manipulated the statistics to infer there isn't criminal problems in countries. Well, there is. And it has to be dealt with. What are we going to do? Just pretend it's not a problem and hope it goes away? No.
Yeah, absolutely correct, man. Absolutely correct. I mean, look at Sweden, the wonderful place of Sweden, where 3 cops a day are quitting. They're leaving because they just can't deal with it anymore.
Well, here's an interesting thing regarding EU immigration. Now, we have major flashpoints. I mean, I said something on a podcast recently, and it's true. The vast bulk of people who are migrants are perfectly peaceful people who don't intend to cause any problem, but there is a hardcore element in all these nations, be it Sweden, be it Germany, be it Holland. I mean, France, there's almost like open warfare in certain parts of the cities around France. Now, the point is, from what I understand, and this is for me is particularly interesting, is there's a belief, obviously, at some point it will boil over to the biblical proportions in France. At that point, Germany intends to get involved to try and help them. But have a guess who else is going to support the Germans and the French? The Russians.
Mm.
Russia will get involved to try and help them deal with a problem, and it is going to be a huge problem. This idea that we're just going to pretend it's not going to be a problem, what is going to end up happening is you're going to have huge problems within all the European nations as a result of it. And in the process, a lot of perfectly innocent people are going to get caught in this mess who aren't a problem. But there is a problem, and the idea that we just pretend it isn't an issue, and we're not going to do anything about it, is utterly ridiculous. And you're right, Sweden's a great example, but there are other nations. People in the police force are demoralized by what's going on because they can't deal with problems. There are issues, and now we're starting to see some kind of backtracking where across the European Union, I think even Merkel said, we're going to have to rein in the kind of migrant problem that we've had. But the issue is, what happens next? What do? You can't. What are you going to do? Throw everyone out of countries? How are you going to manage this process? And it is something that has got completely out of hand. And no one wants to talk about it because apparently, if you do, you're part of the problem. No, it's not. racist to talk about immigration problems. They do exist. And as I say, there's plenty of perfectly innocent people who don't cause any problems. And that's fine, but there is a problem. Now, I think a lot of these people were put into nations. I mean, I was told 2 years before there was any migration process out of Syria, there'll be a massive immigration problem across Europe, and the cabal have engineered it. Why? Because they want to destabilize Europe. They want excuses to say, oh, we've got a major problem in the European Union. We're going to have to centralize more control and power and influence. I mean, because of course, that's exactly what the European Union is. Anybody who
Yeah.
imagines the European Union was ever meant to be beneficial to a single person who lives in that European Union is completely living in la la land. It was never reality.
Right.
I mean, it's like what happened. I mean, I know with respect to Holland, Lisa said as soon as Holland joined the European Union, the price of everything went up hugely. That's exactly the
Yeah.
first thing that happened. But that's good. That's good for people, not a problem. And the list goes on and on and on. And unfortunately, there's a desire to destabilize the European Union. Now, of course, ultimately, they're not going to succeed in what they're doing. But we're now seeing huge resistance coming in from Germany, where everybody in Germany is beginning to go, look, we've had enough of this. And there was proposals for reforms by Juncker, and apparently they've put that on the back burner. And why? Because the statement was, if you try to implement these kind of reforms, you're just going to stoke up more anti-EU resentment in nations. Well, yes, of course, but the fact is, by doing nothing to resolve the problems, it's also stoking anti-EU sentiment. I mean, what was the thing? They had the referendum in France and Holland 12 years ago about the European Union, and no one wanted to stay in it, everyone wanted to leave. And they just ignored the votes and then cancelled the votes in 6 other nations, said, oh, we're not going to have them anymore. It's like the Lisbon Treaty in Ireland. They voted against it and they said, well, that's the wrong result. You'll have to vote again. And then oh, no, you still got the wrong result. Oh, no, finally we got the right result and you're going to be part of the Lisbon Treaty. I mean, it's this kind of insanity. And then people say, oh, the European Union's a great thing for Europe. Well, tell me one thing that's ever been of any value to any European nation. Well, if you include debt, I mean, if debt, mind you, debt's the new kind of money. So Greece is rolling in it; they're rich. So is
They're
Italy and
rich.
every other nation.
Well,
Spain,
so is Zimbabwe, man. Zimbabwe's got the most amount of starving billionaires on the planet.
yeah, well, trillionaires probably by now. And
Billionaires. Yes.
so yeah,
It's
and meanwhile the ECB just carries on, and that's the other. Oh, just a small point that'd probably be of huge interest. We know that the Bundesbank and the ECB have been at war with each other in a polite way to do with QE, the QE policy, because the Bundesbank realizes the insanity of it. And the
yeah.
ECB keeps, I mean, they've now owned something like 70 billion euros of corporate bonds. Never mind all the sovereign bonds there. But by all accounts, very recently, the Bundesbank effectively, in a very polite way, gave Draghi a kick in his midriff, shall we say, and said, we've had enough of this, enough's enough. And at some point in the future, we're going to see the results of that because the Bundesbank is fed up of European central bank policy. And absolutely, because everyone says Germany's the big beneficiary of it. Well, no, they ultimately carry the can for all the debt of the European Union. Now, if it's 21 trillion currently, Germany's not going to sit very pretty at the end of it. But of course, that was the game all along. Germany was never intended to be a great beneficiary. It was a way of controlling Germany. I mean, Germany wanted unification. We said this before. So the agreement was, well, you form the European Union, and you also, in the process, will have to adopt the euro as a currency. But they were put on the hook for everything. So they'd always toe the line and behave themselves. Why? Because the big cabal fear has always been
Germany and
Germany's going
Russia.
to rotate and Russia, and so on and so on. Well, every day the cabal's pushing Germany closer and closer towards Russia, and they've been in talks for at least probably now 3 years privately, but publicly, we're hearing statements like, "Do you know what? Wouldn't it be quite good for Germany to have a free trade agreement with Russia?"
Yep.
I mean, and so on and so
Absolutely.
on, and the list is endless of things. So, yeah, the European Union's turning into a huge melting pot, and week by week, it's disintegrating. There's more and more. I mean, anger and resentment amongst governments, and there's also anger and resentment amongst people. And yeah, the Dutch elections happen on the 15th of March as well. We'll see what actually happens with that. You've got the ongoing French elections, and certainly the thing that came out that was interesting is that everyone said, the Pens, this extremist, they've got no policies, and apparently they sat down with certain people like Barclays and BlackRock and US pension funds and various other organizations, and they all said, you know what, their economic policies are actually make sense, and even though they're saying we need to end the European Union, it might sound extreme, but in reality it makes sense because everyone knows. No one will just say it publicly because they're frightened of destroying their careers, but you and I can say it. The
Yeah.
European Union is dead and buried. It needs to end. It needs to end sooner rather than later because it is an utter farce. But these people are terrified of saying it because they know that, if I worked for one of these organizations and publicly went on one of the mainstream financial things like Bloomberg and said this, I'd be sacked the following day or laughed to the point that
Yeah.
people would say I was insane. But it has to be said because it's reality.
Right. Absolutely correct. I mean, the whole European Union, as far as I'm concerned, it's a dead man. It's a dead corpse. The spirit has left the body. There's no brain waves anymore. It's just that the grieving relatives just don't want to pull the plug.
Well, it is. It's been on life support since, well, before 2008. I mean, well,
Yeah.
arguably it was on life support from its inception because let's face it, how could you ever seriously imagine you could marry the economies of Germany, France, Italy, Holland, and with all due respect, Spain, Portugal,
Hmm.
and nations like that, and Greece? It was never a reality, but it was never intended to be a reality. I mean, it was the way, let's suck everyone in from day one, give them all these little sweeteners. Well, they're called loans, but don't worry about the loan. Oh, but hang on, but a few years later, we're going to punish you with huge austerity and we'll steal all your assets and you'll owe us more, But don't worry, you're 300 billion euros in debt. Here's another 50 billion, but don't worry about the consequences. And of course, now it's reached farcical proportions. I mean, how can anybody seriously with a debt of 20 trillion euros at least? And then there's all the unfunded liabilities. It's like the UK. I mean, they talk about the debt to GDP ratio of 85%, which is bad enough. But what's the unfunded liabilities like the US? What is it? 100 billion? Sorry, 100
Yeah.
trillion, 200
Hmm.
trillion. No one knows. It is enormous, and we could spend a whole hour just talking about the economic malaise of the likes of the US and the economic reality with all the unfunded liabilities. But it's the same in the UK. So none of this is at all a reality in terms of trying to present to you and I that this is a success. But of course, what I find incredulous is how anybody actually sits there and would go, do you know what, if I was $200,000 or £200,000 in debt, I'm in a good financial situation. They go, no, I'm not. But in terms of nations, they've been brainwashed into believing, well, that's fine. It doesn't matter. We can just kick the can down the road and the debt can keep rising and rising. Well, if come March the 15th, Trump says enough's enough and pulls the drawbridge up and says no more,
Yeah.
that will send a catalytic series of events, which is going to start with the stock market's going to have an aneurysm,
Yeah.
probably fairly quickly. I mean, maybe not, like a 10% drop in day, but it's going to affect it. And there's people saying, oh, well, the stock market needs a correction of 20%. No, it needs a correction of about 70%. In
Yep.
reality, that may seem extreme, but that's the reality. It's completely bust. How many organizations are really strong economically, globally? And this is the other thing. If people think this is a big ruse for the cabal, well, the cabal's done a great job of destroying all their own corporations in the process because they're all reeling. I mean, all the energy sector just across the globe, even the big ExxonMobil, we've talked about this before, are in massive financial trouble. Well, why would they destroy their own corporations if this was a big, gigantic plan of theirs? What, they're just going to implode everything and then magically produce some solution? No one's going to buy that.
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
Exactly. Exactly. This whole thing is not some sort of a road warrior, Mad Max type end game scenario. What it is basically vertical integration, wiping out their competition, securing the wealth, and integrating the rest of us on the planet to some sort of a neo feudalism under these technocratic rule by these technocrats, and that's what this whole game is. Like you said it best. They're not going to go ahead and destroy their markets. They don't want to do any of that. They want to keep the ruse going. This is their wealth extraction machine. This is how they get the wealth out of people.
Yeah, and you summed it up perfectly in what you said. No, that's exactly what they try to do. And of course, they don't realize in the process. I mean, I get people saying, well, what's what Russia and China are doing got to do with me? It's got everything to do with the Western world. We have to look at everything in this multipolar way. We can't just say, well, it doesn't really matter what Russia and China. It absolutely matters. Look at what they're doing. I mean, they've China economically is carving up a real niche in the Middle East now. It's also done it through Pakistan with the Pakistan Economic Corridor, which gives them access all the way to the Gwadar port, which just happens to be right near the Straits of Hormuz, which is
Right.
geopolitically a hugely significant waterway through the Middle East. Do they
Yeah.
think that was just a coincidence? No, it's part of a global change in terms, and it's not a controlling mechanism. It's to readdress the imbalances in the world and say we can't have this anymore. And we don't need to dominate nations. I mean, this idea as well, at one point, China's going to invade the world. China's got no intention of invading the world. Neither's Russia. What they don't need to. It's like Iran. Iran. When did Iran last invade a nation?
Never.
Exactly.
Never.
And yet apparently they're the serious enemy to the world. No, the enemy to the world, and unfortunately the US and the UK and other nations have been branding this. It's the cabal who were, not nations per se. And all the whole one belt, one road and the new Silk Road, whatever you want to call it, initiative, and there's huge amounts of stuff out there. Yeah, I've written an article, loads of other people have written it. This is the economic future. What China and Russia are doing is saying to nations, we don't need to be at war with you anymore. You don't need to have this war footing. You can have economic cooperation. You can have military cooperation. No, it's not about blowing other nations up. It's being defensive. And the whole point of NATO, it should have been defensive, not offensive. And a
Correct.
defensive military capability. This is why Russia sells all the S-400 to nations, including like Turkey are now lining up for it. It's a mechanism to defend nations. Nations need to have that security. If people think that the world going forward, even when the cabal's gone, is just going to be no one's going to attack each other, we're not going to have these problems, that is not going to happen. It certainly is not going to happen overnight. It will take a number of years for the world to stabilize in that regard. And eventually, yes, the bottom, but we've got to get to the bottom and the root of the problem. We talk about all this debt. Who is financing? Who's funding it? Now, arming Al Qaeda, Daesh, who at the Islamic State, and any other terrorist organizations. If you want to solve the problem, let's get to that. We have to deal with that initially. But the idea of these rogue elements are just going to disappear isn't going to happen. So nations have to have security. It doesn't mean they're on a war footing. And I think Trump has said certain things that kind of came across like that and were probably badly phrased. But in reality, he's talking about wanting to pull out of all these conflicts around the world because he knows it's insane. It doesn't do the US reputation globally any good. And in the process, how much money has the US spent? Imagine what it could have spent $10 trillion on productively to grow it as a nation, apart, as opposed to just basically incinerating the rest of the planet with all the intending, or not the entire planet, of course, in the
Yeah.
process, be it Iraq,
Absolutely.
Afghanistan, anywhere else in the world. That kind of madness has got to end, and it will end. But you can't expect miracles. That's the other problem. Everyone thinks, oh, well, when the cabal's gone, the world's going to be this wonderful place in 5 minutes, 5 weeks. No. And it's down to us as people. We're all going to have to roll our sleeves up and work as part of the process. The US will only be rebuilt when the population helps to rebuild it. Nations aren't great because of leaders. Leaders might be able to give guidance, but the nation as a whole, it's the same in the UK. If you want to change things, people are going to have to change their attitude towards each other, changing their attitude towards the nation they live in, and work together to achieve common goals. And they can do this. But if they think they're just going to sit there and magically it'll all change, it's an illusion. And people have been fed this illusion, I think, partly to make them passive and go, I don't need to do anything. It's all going to be done for me. Well, that's exactly what the cabal have done in a nefarious way. Do we really think progress for humanity is going to be, well, more of the same, but maybe slightly different? We are going to give you some nice goodies in the process. No, we're all going to have to work
Right.
damn hard to change the world, and that's exactly what we need to do. And if you're great, if you're great to be the US future US president, and from a meritocratic point of view, you'll be given the opportunity. If you're great in the financial sector, you might be great in the arts, you might be great in commerce. If we get the right people leading and doing what needs to be done, then it's going to make that process a lot easier. And that's exactly what we need to strive towards. But it's going to take a number of years this to really change everything completely. There's going to be difficult. You're going to get flashpoints across Europe. You're probably going to get flashpoints in the US in situations. I mean, but there are problems, and there are teething problems. You know, Trump's idea about the tariffs is is really, really ridiculous, because he's saying, well, on the one hand, yes, I understand why he thinks imposing tariffs on other nations, but here's the problem. Does he think they're going to sit there and go, well, that's fine, you can impose punishing tariffs on us, but when you export to us, we're not going to do it to you? And the one thing the US needs to do in the new world from their perspective is have a buoyant export market. So it's not going to work. You can't do that now. That's common sense. And there's all these business leaders going, yeah, great idea, let's impose tariffs on people. Well, if you do that, even nations like Mexico have already said, will respond in kind. So what is the point?
Yeah.
There is
Right.
no point. They need to sit down and have a sensible, mature discussion and say, okay, there are issues with NAFTA, absolutely. There are issues with trade agreements, and I agree with Trump. Every nation on this planet should be able to negotiate their own trade deals with any nation, you know, be it the UK and the US, the UK and Mexico, or the US and Mexico, whatever it is. That needs to happen, but there needs to be some mature discussion. And imposing tariffs and having this naive view that other nations won't respond, they absolutely will respond. And if you want to get into a trade war with China, well, there's only going to be one outcome. And it's not going to work for the US or any other nation trying to do that. China's far too adept. I mean, they've rotated their economy already. They know exactly what they're doing. They don't want a trade war with anybody. But if someone's going to start imposing ridiculous tariffs on them, and then, of course, he also came out with the point about the Chinese manipulating their currency without actually saying, well, what exactly has been going on with the dollar since the days of the petrodollar? No manipulation there? Well, obviously, absolutely, there has been. Okay, it's not his responsibility, but the US dollar's been badly manipulated because it was the reserve currency of the world. We know all the games that have been going on. And yes, you may argue China's devalued its currency intentionally, but what, 6% in a year sounds extreme. Well, it's not really particularly. And it wasn't designed to attack the US particularly. China's looking after its interests to a certain extent, and yes, it may have impacted other nations, but there's no point pointing the finger when you need to say, look, there is problems. Let's talk about it privately with China and say we need to come to some agreement how we're going to manage this going forward. But let's not have a public spat about apparently the Chinese devaluing, and he's also accused, obviously, the Japanese. Well, he doesn't actually realize the US role in the yen carry trades.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the
Absolutely.
reason why the yen's been manipulated. It's the same reason the dollar has been massively manipulated. Well, yeah, it was for the cabal, and we know the reasons why this went on for the decades it has. But so he needs to kind of pick his arguments and be a little bit more circumspect. But of course, there may be an argument that says, well, he's doing all this because it's just playing the game. He's got to appear to be tough on all these nations because he has to appease the people. Because ultimately, there's going to be the hardcore Democrats he's never going to change, but he's going to have to change the viewpoints of people in his nation. As more and more people support his viewpoint, then that's going to make his administration stronger and less likely to be derailed in terms of what they're trying to do. And that's a statement of the obvious, and maybe that is part of it. But at times he has made some statements which I think are unwise, to put it politely, and you need to take a step back and stop going on grandstanding about nations on a world stage. Stick to sorting out the US as a priority, and look to make concessions to other nations and come to some mutual agreement. And certainly with Russia and China, there's a lot of rhetoric on the surface, but beneath it there is definitely a lot of discussion going on, and a meeting of minds on many things. But of course, publicly they're not going to admit to that, and that's part of the reason why we're hearing, well, there's these secret talks going on, there's strange, nefarious activities going on between Russia and the US. No, it's just called diplomatic channels in terms of resolving things, and
Yeah.
it's something that has to happen. But there needs to be a slightly different approach. And while Russia's in my mind, the whole thing about Churkin suddenly dropping dead suddenly, he just dropped dead of a heart attack. It's a very sad thing. He was a great ambassador for Russia. He was very liked and well respected. But sadly, probably the stress of what he was doing was ultimately what killed him. He wasn't poisoned. He wasn't killed. Things just happen sometimes. Yes, what happened to the Russian ambassador in Turkey was clearly obvious because he was killed. But no, Churkin wasn't. He just died, and very unfortunately, and probably the stress of the job. And given the amount of crap and he had to deal with on a day-to-day basis, it's no wonder. But the world would be a very poorer place for not having him, because in the face of an onslaught of insults and everything else, he just maintained his counsel and was very articulate in presenting the reality of things. But that's all it is. He wasn't murdered, and so that's another conspiracy theory that needs to be buried.
Yep, absolutely. Paul, we're at the top of the hour, man. Why don't you give out your site, how people could follow you, and how they can subscribe to your podcast, bro?
Well, first off, thank you, and thanks, Rogue Money, V, CJ, all your support. You've been, really, really helpful getting us on the show and everything else. We really value, all your support for us. But obviously, the website's the SiriusReport.com. That's SIRIUS. We've got about 100 articles on there. They're generally just ways of showing the kind of things we discuss and we're interested in. It gives people a bit of an insight. Yes, we've got the premium content section, which costs $4.75 a month. You get 22 podcasts a month, 5 podcasts every week, usually 10 to 15 minutes long. We cut everything to the chase. We think we give you an hour's worth of stuff or more in 10 or 15 minutes. A lot of people said they need to listen to it a few times. Well, yeah, we try to cram as much in. It is intelligence. There is in-depth analysis of what's going on globally on a daily basis. Sometimes we'll focus on certain things. So more detail. Yeah, we'd love you to subscribe to it. And thanks, V, for all your very kind comments at the start of the show. And of course, we have, the Twitter page at the Sirius Report. We've got the Facebook page, which is the Sirius Report. And there's one that is for subscribers only, which is a closed group. And in reality, I think, we've got the YouTube channel, which is the London Paul YouTube channel. We haven't done a huge amount. That's just to give people some little bit of insight to the kind of analysis we've done. I did one about the petrodollar, which was a couple of minutes long, and people liked it and said, it very succinctly gave the background historically to what's going on. So it's just to give people a kind of indication of the kind of things that we do and we discuss in more detail. And I think that's about it. But again, thanks, to you guys for all your support. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. It's our pleasure. Our pleasure. All right. And that brings us to the end of our broadcast. So thank you for everyone for being with us today. This is producer CJ, and we are over and out. Take care.